Professor Brian Clayton co-authored this book, Two Wings, Integrating Faith and Reason, with Douglas Crees. Professor Clayton is the director of the Faith and Reason Institute and associate professor of philosophy at Gonzaga University, where he teaches courses on faith and reason. And one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, another author I like very much, Walker Percy, and J.R.R. Tolkien, whom everyone likes. Professor, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Two Wings, Integrating Faith and Reason. Why did you feel that you should write this book now?
Well, the book developed out of a course that we had team taught, Doug and I had team taught with the former president of the university, Father Robert J. Spitzer of the Society of Jesus. And it really just sort of brings together everything we have been doing over the last 18 or so years and puts it in one place for students. So it really originates in the course. So
I'm reading this book now by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now. And his basic argument, I mean, to be a little unfair to him, to condense his argument, is look how great things are. Everybody lives so much longer. Everybody's healthier. Everybody's got food, less disease. And it's all because of the Enlightenment. And the people in the Enlightenment, yes, some of them were deists, but that was just because they couldn't quite let go of this superstition. But if we could just, it's the people who want to drag us back to faith in God, people who want to drag us back to religion, who are getting in the way of this wonderful, wonderful thing that has happened to us in the last 300 years. What's your argument against that?
Well, I think that there are people who have what some philosophers have called the Enlightenment agenda, where they were in the Enlightenment very much attacking religion, right? And so those who have inherited that agenda sort of continue the attack, and I take Pinker to be part of that. And what that involves, in part, is denying the actual history of the rise of modern science and the rise of the rule of law and so forth, much of which can be traced back to the medieval period and to Christian thinkers in particular. I mean, it was in the Latin West, in the Latin Christian West, that modern science has its origins, and going back as far as the 12th and 13th centuries. So I think it's a very narrow view of the history of our civilization to think that the Enlightenment suddenly was this major break with what had gone before. So that's part of the response. And then on the other side, it seems to me that there are people who have kind of bought into, well-meaning people who've bought into the idea that there's an opposition between faith and reason, or between science and faith. And their response has been to become what we call in the book fideistic. And so they sort of abandon reason. So they give it over to the Enlightenment and to those who inherit the Enlightenment agenda. And so you wind up with the Enlightenment having kind of a hyper-rationalist approach to things, and you have the fideist having a hyper-faith approach to things, and then it's some of the fideists in particular who do the kinds of things that presumably Pinker is objecting to.
Okay.
Right? But if one has an integration of faith and reason, if one understands the history and the ideas and the arguments in particular, then one sees that there's no opposition between all the wonderful things that he likes in the modern contemporary world and faith, the traditional faith.
I'm really happy to hear you talking about this so clearly, because it seems absolutely true to me, but it also seems important to explain in ways that people can understand. So we have this now fairly good mechanistic understanding of the world. We understand that when you pull this lever, this thing flies out, and we understand the laws of thermodynamics and so on. Why does God still remain a reasonable thing to believe in?
I would actually go back to St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm not Roman Catholic. My colleague Doug Crees is. I teach at a Roman Catholic university. But I think St. Thomas, who had a great deal of respect for the new sciences that we're developing, offers a way of pointing out what gets left out of that sort of mechanistic picture. We can think in terms of the mechanisms that operate at the material level, but why, for example, is there order? There doesn't have to be order, right? And the things that are ordered, say the motions of the planets and so forth, we say, oh, well, that's due to the laws of nature. Well, the laws of nature describe what happens. They don't cause what happens, right? So we need some account, some kind of causal account as to why things are as they are. I agree with St. Thomas that probably the clearest way of getting this is getting at this is what he calls the first way, or what's known as the first way, which is in order to understand the observed fact that things around us change. Sometimes called the unmoved mover argument, but it's the unchanged changer is the way to think about it. We observe that change happens. Okay, why is that? Well, what's involved in change? Well, anything that changes has the potential to change, but that potential has to be actualized by something. Well, then that means you have to have an actualizer, and then the question is, well, does that actualizer have any potentiality that needs to be actualized in order for it to operate as an actualizer?
Okay. All right.
Right? And so you can't have then an infinite chain of actualizers that require actualization. Eventually, you have to get to something that actualizes without itself being actualized. As a matter of fact, it can't be actualized. It's unactualizable. It's just fully actual. And Thomas says, and this is what we call God. So if we're, in order to understand sort of the basic phenomena that we see in the world around us, this is Thomas's argument, there are certain conditions that have to be met. One of those conditions is you need a fully actual actualizer, and this is what we call God. That's what creation is.
And it's not like a finger knocking over a domino. It's more like a hand spinning a rope, right? I mean, it's actually the thing that's happening in the.
Yes, it's happening right now. Creation is not something that happened in the past. It's happening right now. It's more like the musician singing a song. And so the musician, the singer, and the song, right? They're going on at the same time together. I mean, what's misleading is that that's a process that happens in time, and of course, God isn't in time, can't be in time.
Right.
But this is when I look around the world right now, I'm seeing creation, the creation. It's the one act that God is doing.
Right, right. The singer and the song, great metaphor. Now,
it's not original.
Yeah, it sounded like it had some tradition behind it. Now, what about this new science? And this is a thing that Pinker pushes very hard. A lot of the new atheists push this very hard. The idea that eventually they're going to find, and they're finding now, that our decisions that we think are free will are actually happening at the quantum level, and we only become aware of them after they're already made by material things. Do you worry at all that anything in the new brain science and anything in these new amazing looks at the human machine? Do you worry at all that they're going to erase the idea of the individual freedom?
I don't, but on several different grounds. But just one, for example. If one looks at what's going on inside the body when I'm thinking about something, one doesn't see thinking, right? You see neurons firing, you see blood flowing in particular ways, other systems in the body reacting, and so forth. But you don't see a thought. You don't see the act of thinking itself. So thinking seems to be which would be involved, say, in deciding, exercising will. That doesn't seem to be the same kind of thing that's being talked about when I'm talking about neurons firing, or I'm talking about neurochemicals or whatever. And it's not clear at all how you're supposed to relate to the two. You may get a correlation. Oh, well, whenever somebody is thinking, there are these neurons firing, and there's brain moving in these, or blood moving in these ways. But that's not the same thing as the thinking. And how do you get from neurons firing to thinking or deciding or exercising my will? I don't. It's a conceptual problem. I just don't see how you ever bridge the gap.
It always confuses me of why, when they say that, why they don't posit that the thinking causes the brain flashes rather than the other way around. I mean, that something is
Certainly.
because it's outside of the material world, so they can't imagine. Now, what about the vexed question of evolution? I am a believer in evolution, but I've never understood why anybody should think it's random, or how you would even know it was random if you're inside the system. How, it's like an ant knowing that his anthill is, what's happening outside of his anthill. I mean,
Right.
Does evolution bother you in terms of biblical teaching?
No, not at all.
Okay.
And of course, speaking from a Roman Catholic university, the Catholic tradition has a long history of reflecting on this and not having a problem with the idea that part of the way in which God creates, or part of his creation that he's creating, is to set in motion, or cause to be, things that have causal properties, that behave in regular ways. They have causal powers, and so it's perfectly open to God to bring about living things through processes that he has established, causal existing things that have causal powers that enable them to undergo a process of natural selection or whatever, and you wind up with things that are alive, or you wind up with different kinds of species, etc. So, I mean, certainly in broad outline, I don't think there's a problem. And as far as the biblical account itself, if one goes back to someone like St. Augustine, Augustine wrote a work on the literal interpretation of Genesis, and he says, well, whatever's going on when it talks about the 6 days of creation, the day of rest, it can't mean days like we mean days, right? Because of when the sun is created, for one thing, it's conveying something else, right? It's attempting, it's communicating that all of creation is dependent at all times upon the Creator for its existence.
Right.
And that's really the point. And then, of course, then you have the chapters devoted to the creation of humans, and it's making a different point there. It's talking about the special dignity that human beings have. But all of that is compatible with the scientific theory of descent with modification by means of natural selection.
I suppose there's a kind of a basic question that's I'm not sure that Pinker has ever said this, but it's kind of inherent in Pinker. It's certainly inherent in some of these thinkers, that if I can feed people with science, if I can make people live longer, if I can even this guy who wrote this book, Sapiens, basically believes soon people will live forever, and why do I need God? Why do I need faith?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's an acknowledgement of reality. I mean, it changes that kind of, I would think that would be important to a scientist to acknowledge reality. Yeah. And if it is the case, as I think it is, and we have good arguments to show this, that the whole created order is dependent upon God, say the unmoved mover, God, and the uncaused cause, the intelligent cause of all else that exists. And then one goes on to reflect on, well, what is this reality that we're talking about? What is this creator reality that we're talking about? Well, it's completely different than anything else that we know. And so God is utterly transcendent in that way, but also fully immanent, right? Present to every part of my body at all moments at which I exist. Nothing's closer to me than God is. Then you begin to ask, well, what's my relationship with this reality? And that's where the religious question really comes in. I mean, what's the proper response to this reality? And theists have always responded, the proper response is worship.
Okay, all right. I guess I'm running out of time, but I really do want to ask you this final question. I read a lot of books about people worrying about the state of the West and worrying about our tradition collapsing. And again, I've seen this now in maybe 5 or 6 books. The writer, usually a very proficient intellectual, very accomplished intellectual, will say, yes, it all depends on Christianity. Christianity is the bottom block in the Jenga tower, but I just can't believe. I can't believe. I can pretend I'm a Christian. I can support Christian tradition, but I can't believe. And I usually feel that what they're stumbling on is the miraculous. The idea, I always joke that I believe a Jewish carpenter rose from the dead, and I've never even seen a Jewish carpenter. But I think, I sympathize with this. I mean, we live in this world of wonders. Do you need the miraculous? Do you need to believe in the miracle of the resurrection, for one thing, and in some of the other miracles, to have true faith?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if Christ be not risen, our faith is in vain.
Right.
I mean, right. But again, if we take the idea, the classical understanding of God that theists have, the idea of miracles doesn't look like somebody standing outside the machine, to take that mechanical metaphor, and reaching a screwdriver in and trying to make adjustments. So it's not like some kind of intervention. Instead, the miracles are themselves part of the one act of creation. It's woven into the whole story as we experience it in time of God creating. So if we look at it as a kind of intervention, and how do we justify, why would God intervene, and why would it be reasonable to believe that God has intervened? I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It's more like, the singer was singing this song, and we thought it was going to go in this direction, but no, it kind of varied, right? We had a variation on the theme here.
And that does happen in life. I mean, we see it in life,
Yes.
and then you find the reasonable explanation afterward, and you explain it
Yes.
backwards. Yeah.
Yes.
Really interesting. Brian Clayton, the co-author with Douglas Crees of Two Wings, Integrating Faith and Reason. Very clear, as you speak very clearly, you write very clearly, and it's much appreciated. I hope you have a great Easter, and thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a happy Easter yourself.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
That I'm always happy to hear those things explained so well, and it's obvious that he's given it a lot of thought. And the book, like I said, I've only been able. I got the book very, very late, and I've only been able to dip into it and read parts of it. But it's incredibly clear. And when I went, what I did, as I often do when I'm testing something, is I went to the parts that I know about and found it really responsible, not just well reasoned, but also well read and intelligent. Two Wings, Integrating Faith and Reason. So